just so folks know, we will be recording this, and we will send out a link to the recording. It takes us a day or so to get it organized. But we wanted to talk just to get us in thinking about what we're going to talk about for the next couple of hours. These are some of our quick facts. Providing warm water, 45 to 65 degrees. Remember to feed additional hay during extreme cold. We'll talk about why that's important. Make sure there's access to shelter, and we'll talk about the types of shelter. Performing regular hoof care is important. Assessing your horse's body condition regularly before we get into winter and then during the winter. Evaluating your facilities, stability and ventilation, and we'll talk more about that. So first of all, we need to think about winterizing our horse to get them ready for winter. We'll talk a little bit about acclimatizing to cold weather, and trying to avoid blankets before the shortest day of the year is a way to get our horses to grow, or our horses, ponies and donkeys, to grow full winter coats. That's going to be the best protection for them. And again, before winter, you want to check that body condition score. And we do have a chart. We have a fact sheet actually from Extension that you can put a number on the body condition score, and tracking that is important. And doing a health evaluation and involving your veterinarian in that. We'll talk about what's needed to get them ready for winter. And think about any horses that might need any special care requirements for the winter. And a couple of you had mentioned you've got some older horses that you're trying to care for. And you do need to consider that when we're getting into winter, and especially when we have these really cold temperatures. So before winter, Beth, did you want to take this?
Sure. As there are things you'd really like to get accomplished before you have problems with cold weather, because some things are much easier to do, say in October, November, before it gets really cold and snowy. So one thing, everyone is always concerned with internal parasites, the fecals, the exams that need to be done to check for the eggs per gram. If the whole science of treating animals for parasites has undergone a fair amount of change in the last 10 years or so, or even more recently. It used to be that we wormed horses routinely, maybe 4 times a year. When I was a kid, I had friends who would worm their horses every time their horses got shod, which was every 8 weeks. So we were worming indiscriminately. It's turned out that 80% of the horses shed 20% of the horses shed 80% of the worms. And so you'll get some horses may have a high infection level, but they are what's called low shedders. And those low shedders, which produce less than 200 eggs per gram in a fecal sample, you might just worm them twice a year, or even some of them just once a year. A horse, if their eggs per gram level is over 200, between 200 and 500, it's called a moderate shedder. And it's everyone has their own sort of way to deal with, every vet has their own method to deal with these numbers, but this is one suggestion that you might consider. A moderate shedder, maybe deworming 3 times a year. And if the horse is a high shedder with over 500 eggs per gram, you really want to make sure that you get them wormed with something that's an effective anthelmintic that will decrease that, because those high shedders, they may have the same number of worms, but they just make a lot of eggs and they contaminate pastures and are a risk to other horses. So more parasites. Check the vaccination status, depending on where you are in the winter. If your horse might be so lucky as to travel to Florida in the winter and escape the cold, certain parts of the South, you will find mosquito diseases prevalent and a risk even in the winter. So any horse going south, we really should have a booster on Eastern Western encephalitis. make sure their, animals are out and about in the winter, there's rabies as well. So make sure that's current. Have the teeth checked by your favorite veterinarian, your favorite veterinary dentist, or your favorite person who has made taking care of teeth a career choice. And some of them are very skilled. Make sure there are no broken teeth, there are sharp edges, any other thing that can impair the horse's ability to process feed and get the most out of his food for the winter. Vitamin E levels, I'm not sure how many of you are aware of the vitamin E problem with horses. If horses are not on grass for a significant part, several hours every day during grazing season, some horses are kept in places where they're not able to get grass. And therefore, we have to depend on supplementing vitamin E. If the vitamin E is low going into winter, there's basically no vitamin E left in hay. It's pretty well gone several days after the hay is made. There are most grains get vitamin E put in them, but if the horse is low going into the winter, then you may be at risk for having neurologic problems, muscle wasting, even some changes in the eye if the horses have low vitamin E. Then before winter, this is always a problem at my house, particularly the rats and mice move in, man. They know when winter's coming, and you really have to knock them back in that early fall. Else you have I've had rat condos at my house. They were difficult to work with. I picked this slide because I was thinking of the things that as veterinarians we see in the winter that are our biggest headaches. The biggest problem that we have is horses don't get enough water. It could be temporary, it could be just a day they don't get enough, but the subsequent dehydration and predisposing horses to colic, which is number 2. Colic can also happen because of horses being confined in bad weather. They get a different diet, their time frame changes. So stable management can have a big effect on the happiness of the horse's gut system. We see respiratory problems because people get cold, so they close up their barns, and we'll have a little bit more about ventilation later on. Everyone hopes they buy hay or can make hay that is dust-free, but it's pretty likely that somewhere in that shipment of hay, you'll get one bale that's got dust, and making sure you don't expose the horses repeatedly to dusty hay and develop severe chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. There's also a problem with, at very low temps, horses don't do well with hard work when the temps below 0. That air can be a little bit difficult on the lungs. Also, in the winter, we see skin infections, both bacterial and fungal. Commonly, you're all familiar with scratches, probably rain rot, and also horses that wear blankets that aren't changed according to the temperature. Say a horse that's in a heavyweight blanket repeatedly, they might get some of those skin infections. I think there are a couple more on the next one, Donna. We also see a lot of injuries and soft tissue trauma from horses slipping on ice. We get scrapes. We've had horse fall on the ice, break a tibia. So that's a real problem. And we've been lucky up north this way. We've had lots of snow, so the snow is a better surface. But I know in coastal Maine, it's been glare ice. Lots of people's paddocks have been like skating rinks, and we've had numerous down horses on the ice. The other thing in the winter, when horses are turned out in groups, there is a lot of competition for food and even getting at the water. So you need the social groupings of your horses have to be really monitored. One horse starts getting excluded from the feed piles or pushed out of the water, they'll be in trouble. I'll talk about shoeing them a little more later. We say to keep checking on the feet during the winter because things like thrush sort of get, they're standing in all that clean snow, and you just say, well, his foot's going to be good. And the thrush can start and get away from you. And then it's harder to treat when it gets to be in a more severe condition. Laminitis happens. A big thing is loss of condition. Horses that are thin going into winter may lose more condition if you don't carefully watch the body score and the weight tapes. Donna, you have to talk.
Okay, you want me to talk for a little bit? Well, on Beth's list, water is the #1 important thing. It's the most important nutrient. When we study nutrition in horses, they start right out with water is the most important nutrient. And horses need fresh and clean source of water, either outside or and inside the stall. And just to remind you, horses drink an average of 10 to 12 gallons of water a day. And that can be quite a bit, and it can be hard to keep it liquid. We'll have some pictures of options that you can do. And if you can warm that water, horses will be encouraged to drink more. So 40 to 45 degree water would be great. And a lot of people think, well, right now there's a lot of snow out there. And, well, we'll just let them eat snow. That's not an adequate source of water for horses. Anything else you wanted to add, Beth?
I just want to throw in, Donna. I remember
Yes.
I wanted to reading that will drink up to 40% more water if they are given tepid water. So it's and encouraging that water consumption is very important in the winter to avoid impactions and gastric problems.
And Beth shared some pictures of her pasture water facility, I guess you'd call that. And central to that is that water hydrant. And I'll have some pictures a little bit later on that show the water hydrant. Did you want to talk about how you put this together?
Sure. So we have 2 frost-free hydrants. One's actually in the barn, and one we were constructing a new part of the house. We made a new line out that goes into the pasture. So it's totally exposed to that western wind, and at times in the winter, the handle would freeze and we'd have to pour hot water down it. And it was a pain. So I found materials just hanging around, and it was fiberboard and old insulation and some insul tarp, and some shingles left over from a project. So this was built as a temporary structure, actually, but it worked so well that we've just left it. One of these years, I'll replace it with something that's not quite so ugly. But in this door flaps down, and looking inside, you see the hydrants here. There's a plug-in. The electricity came alongside the water line from the house. So we have a heat tape on that line because it goes under the driveway. Plus, in here, most of the time I just plug in a light, and the heat from the light bulb just warms that metal handle just enough so I never want it to be frozen. So coming out of the back of the side of the box, you can see the PVC pipe. It comes downhill a little bit to a heated muck bucket. I am such a proponent of this heated muck bucket. I can keep horses well watered by filling it 3 times a day. So we fill it in the morning. The horses often drink half of it or 2/3 of it by noon. So around noontime, I go fill it again, or whoever happens to be home. And then in the evening, it's filled again. So 3 times a day with this muck bucket will do 4 horses. And I have fairly sizable horses. So I'm sure they drink on the high end of the gallons per day. But this water, I can water the horses in the barn and just carry buckets, and it turns to ice, and they won't even touch it now. I've stopped trying to water them when they're in the barn for short periods because they'll come out and drink preferentially out of this heated muck bucket. The muck buckets last, I've used one simple one for 4 years. If there's not a lot of torque and you can keep the horses from eating the cord, this one has a cord that's covered with wire. they last. If the horses start objecting, I know there's a leak in the electricity in the bottom. I might put it's on top of a rubber mat, try and insulate it from the ground, and they won't get a shock. It's easier to go after you've had one 4 years, you've got good work out of it, you can just go buy another. But they're a great way to water horses, and I think ours have been much healthier since we have this heated water available all the time.
And
yeah, I got one other thing. People think that if they boil water and carry it out and leave it for the horses, it will stay hot longer. But there's a physics reason why water that has been heated, it drives the air out of the water. And so then that water actually freezes faster than cold water does. So don't bother heating the water up in the house and dragging it out, because it's just going to freeze faster.
good point. And here are just some other options. Here's in the barn frost-free hydrant that people use. And note that the hydrant is surrounded by wood and not cement. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Some folks will use a nice long hose attached to a frost-free hydrant, or a hose connection in the house. We've got some other pictures of that. Some folks have a tank on the back of a truck that they might take out and fill water buckets out in paddocks. And the bottom picture is actually a cattle waterer that is heated by, it's sunk down in the earth so far that it gets some of the heat from the ground. And it does have a floating ball. The trouble with horses, they don't particularly appreciate the floating ball as much. And here's another picture of somebody dragging the hose out to fill waterers out in the pasture. And Beth had mentioned, if you don't have that container heated out in the pasture, the water will freeze. And at the bottom, you see a water trough that has the frozen water. You chip it out every day, and then you try to fill it up, and then it becomes a big block of ice. And when you have several paddocks that you're putting animals in, you can have them share one water trough. And that's what the picture in the center is doing. It's showing this big tank is separated by a board. And so animals from both sides of the fence can access the heated water. And the yellow hose with the red circle, that just shows that someone put a metal piece of pipe on a top of the fence post. And that was so the hose, they could feed the hose through it every time they dragged the hose out and fill the water trough. We thought that was a pretty nifty idea. Any other comments, Beth?
No, I sort of internet connection went there.
Okay, then we'll move on.
Yeah, that's
and good. This is a schematic of a frost-free hydrant. And when you put a frost-free hydrant in, it's very important that you have that riser goes down below the frost level. And you see down at the bottom, it says gravel sump. And the larger pieces of gravel or stone that you can have down there, that's where the water that collects in the riser is going to have to drain out every time you open the handle. And the pipeline just goes to your water source. But it's very important to have that gravel sump down below the frost depth. And you can see there are some lengths, and we can share these slides with you so you can see the information. But it talks about, if you're going to bury at a certain depth, you need to have that your hydrant a certain length. And I mentioned don't put cement around that riser, because you will be replacing it every 10 years or so, you'll have to replace it. And if you have it cemented in, you're going to have to get a jackhammer, and it's a hassle. So put wood around it, put something temporary that you'll be able to pull it up when the time comes for you to replace it. So where is the frost-free depth? This is actually from the State of Maine Public Utility Commission. They had a map that showed the frost-free depth, and these are general figures. So if you're in zone 1, you only have to go down 4 feet. In the pink, I'm up here in Dover Foxcroft. We're just barely in the yellow. When I had horses, we had our sump down 6 feet. So, you know,
Wow.
so it's just, do you want to risk it freezing or not? And another thing, if you have your water line going under your driveway, driving over ground drives the frost down deeper. So you want to put some insulation on top of your water line. So you want to be thinking about that.
So we've got a couple of different systems that participants are using. One, Christy's using those the types of hoses that kind of shrink up like a slinky almost. They're pretty commonly available. They're easier to get the water out of, and you can put them in a bucket to keep inside so they don't freeze. So that's a good idea, as opposed to just having a hose wound up with little bits of water in it. So that every time you have the low part of the loop, there's big chunks of ice in there.
I forget to mention, when you roll up that hose, you want to empty the water out of it. You don't want to carry that hose full of water back into your house or wherever you're keeping it warm.
Right.
Yeah.
And
I was to say that this picture with the water with a woman with a hose, that hose was all curled up in a big blue muck bucket, and it was kept in the tack room. So it was easy to uncurl because it was still warm. But yeah, you want to have a system for moving it in and out of the warm. Go ahead.
And then Mary has a Nelson brand automatic water that has a heater built into it. But it's really important to check that every day to make sure that it's working correctly.
Right.
Yeah.
Great.
Good.
Do you want to address the other questions now, or?
Yeah, let's do that.
Because I can just talk a little bit more about the E and the. So the vitamin E levels in absolute minimum for health is probably 200 micrograms per deciliter. We do all the vitamin E testing at Cornell, and you have to handle the sample correctly. Don't expose it to the light, spin them off the clot pretty fast. If I'd rather see a horse's level 500 and over, and I have quite a bit of experience working with herds where the horses never get out on grass. I mean, they're well fed, they have round bales, they're fat and happy, but they just don't get enough green grass to satisfy. So what we found there's the Cadillac of vitamin E supplementation, which is a product called Elevate, made by Kentucky Equine Research. And that is the most absorbable form. It's D-alpha tocopherol. It's the water soluble form. You can go from that to actually, I know we have used a lot of Swanson pills that are gel capsules that have 1,000 units per pill. And we often supplement with up to 5,000 units a day in the winter. If your horse is low, I definitely give 5,000 units and try and get it up there. Maybe 3 months later, do another test and see if they've absorbed it. Some horses seem like they eat a ton of vitamin E, but they can't quite get their levels high enough to get over 200 or 300. Any grass that's cut, and it's probably less with alfalfa, but they say the day you cut that hay, that grass, 80% of the vitamin E is gone. And we alfalfa, people feeding straight alfalfa around here is not very common. And I do feed alfalfa pellets, but I'm not depending on any source of forage that's stored to have much E in it. What else?
Great. I think those were the two questions on that. And then we have one more comment on the watering. Brenda's used the heated water bucket like Beth mentioned, and her husband built an insulated shed around it. And there's a hose that they run to that to the watering system from the house that rolls out onto a wheel, like
Nice.
to roll up the hose. And that the horses drink way more water that way than using the automatic water that doesn't have any heat to it. So when the automatic water, the pipe broke, they just left it and switched over to that new system.
Yeah, it's excellent.
Well, you said they'll drink 40% more water if it's tepid.
I believe it. And
Foot care. Were you going to
Okay.
take this, Beth?
sure, I just ran into a couple pictures we had gotten from cases. So those were my highlight here, but I'll talk about those. Routine foot care in the winter. It's you still need to do it. People tend to if they're not riding a lot and you've got just horses turned out, you tend to let them grow and say, oh, they'll be fine. But you can lead to problems if the toes get really long and the heels get flared and you develop flares, and you can develop thrush and stuff. And if you're not checking the feet every day, it'll get away from you. So still, our horses are trimmed every 6 weeks. You can go 8 weeks. By the time you're 12 weeks, you're really overdue. And you may start to get foot deformities from not being trimmed. So it's always everyone has an opinion, and everybody's management level works with one way or the other. Sometimes places have some horses that are shod and some that are barefoot. Some horses do well barefoot. They learn to be careful on ice. They manage. Their feet are sturdy. Other horses get into trouble. I had a horse that actually panicked every time he hit ice, and his legs he looked like an egg beater, and you couldn't get him anywhere in the winter without having special shoeing for winter. So this picture on top here, look, this bloody hoof. I don't know, if you can see, there's actually a cracked hoof wall right here, partway down. And the horse probably stepped on a chunk of ice and slipped and pulled his hoof wall right off. So that'll take a while to heal, and some really good trimming. You can see the hoof wall is a little bit long, the heels are a little overgrown. So I think they'll be able to get that one. The hoof down below is a whole quarter of the hoof wall cracked out and is gone. So, and that looks like it's been a while, but that must have been pretty painful. The injuries on ice in the winter with young horses, middle-aged, and particularly old horses are a real problem. And it's worth quite a bit of effort to keep those horses from getting into trouble on ice. As I said before, we have had a fractured tibia, numerous down horses that required help from many people moving the horse off the ice, and then also a bit of pain relief for the horse. And after they're moved on to good footing and have some pain relief, they often can get up. But once they get nervous and lose their courage on ice, they are more likely to go down again. Then thrush prevention is a lot easier than thrush cure. So I use their numerous sprays and beautiful purple ointment liquid you can put on frogs to try to keep thrush from flourishing. And I think it's worth doing, just monthly at least, just to make sure you've got a handle on those little tunnels that grow into the frog. And horses can become very lame with thrush. I've been in the embarrassing position of having a horse lame, and a well-known horsewoman locally who was giving me a lesson said, "Have you looked at her feet?" And I went, "Oh my God, she had thrush." So anyway, a good thing to take care of. These are my favorite farrier. This is what we have come down to for our favorite.
Oh.
is use this when you're mean with or 40 horses with shoes on. So this is a regular shoe. Goes between hoof and the shoe. And from the side, you can see that how big the studs are here. They're not exactly on the heel, but under the weight bearing part where the heel comes down. These shoe have toe clips as well. And that's why this pad held in the middle picture has a big chunk. That's where the toe clip goes. The other two pictures just show you can get colored pads. I'd never seen it until I took a picture of that horse, and those pads tend to pop the ice out of the cavity beneath the foot. And these I've ridden all winter on roads without a ring, riding outside with these shoes. They're very good. Recommend them. One of the critical things that we have in winter, horses are meant to move. You know, they are horses standing still in a stall or cramped in an area where they don't get to move are not very happy. Their horses, given footing and giving space, will go out and get a fair amount of exercise themselves. What we call light work for horses is gentle, regular exercise to maintain condition. So this is just, you're going to keep your horse going for the winter by riding it a couple times a week, and not going to work it hard, but just enough to keep some muscle tone and keep the top line so that when the days get better, you can start to work without a lengthy reconditioning. Some people keep horses at indoor arenas or have outdoor facilities that are sanded and workable. And regular work would be 4 to 6 days a week. Hopefully, you know, traditionally the horse gets 1 day off. That's why I didn't say 4 to 7. When people, the trouble with regular work is if you have a horse that's working well, they tend to get sweaty because of their extra coat. Maybe they've got some extra fat. But once they get sweaty, you really need to have a really good method for cooling the horse down and drying their coat. So a polar fleece cooler, actually, it's quite amazing. You get a horse that's steaming and sweating, and you put a polar fleece cooler on it, the sweat and the steam condenses on the fleece instead of on the horse's hair. So the polar fleece draws the condensation right off the hair coat, and a horse will be dry in much quicker than if it didn't have a fleece on. So the other, we do often strategic clipping to prevent the sweating and the prolonged drying times after work. But once you start taking away the horse's natural coat, you've got to provide a replacement. Here you go. Oh, all right. These are my horses. So there's always a question. Should you blanket your horse or can it go naked? So, and it all depends on several things. The first thing is the body condition score. And if you have not blanketed the horse grows a winter coat until the shortest day of the year. And then with increasing light, that winter coat stops growing and they start basically working on the spring coat. A horse can live with no blanket. We have, Dennis and I are basically lazy horse keepers, and we have a shelter that all the horses can fit in, and it's in a storm. It's really kind of a nice place to be. The wind goes around it and you're quite secure. This is horse on the left is our youngest horse, which is just coming to. It was a fat little thing, and she obviously is not. She's Connemara Oldenburg, and she is not bothered by a little dusting on her back. Up in the upper right, you see the horses would rather eat outside in the snow than in that shelter. They can thermoregulate on their own quite well. This is a temperature of chart for blanketing. You know, every facility might have variations of this, but it's mostly to show you that the temperature should determine what weight blanket you put on. So, because the horses can get too hot and they can get too cold. So you don't just put on one blanket for the winter and say, that's your extra coat, and expect them to be able to thermoregulate with all the different temperatures. So one needs a blanket. And 50, you might start having to put some kind of like 40 degrees, that flipped horse might need it. I get a message that said, can you hear me?
You're breaking up quite a bit.
Less than 30 degrees. So when it gets to under.
Why don't you maybe just try shutting your camera off?
20 to
video?
heavyweight blanket. And as it gets. Okay, so. If you didn't hear half of it, you can go to the next one.
Okay.
Beth, do you want to try shutting your video off? Might help the audio come through better.
Jason, I can't hear.
Oh, how about, do you want to try shutting your video off? No, you not hear that.
Do that.
Oh, well.
Yeah.
So, Beth, sometimes if you shut the your video off, shut your camera off, it will give you a little bit more bandwidth.
Okay. Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
Donna, do you feel comfortable? Take that one.
I'll carry on, and perhaps she'll be able to come back in.
Well, Donna,
but when you're trying to decide who to blanket, first look at the body condition score, and if they're old or their teeth are in poor condition, or they're medically in a poor condition, those might be candidates for blanketing. Any horse that's underweight, they're going to have a hard time to keep that weight on during the winter without some extra help from a blanket. Yesterday, Beth was talking about there's some stables that it gets, people think that it might be really interesting to clip their horse, and they start doing all these different types of clips. And remember, when you're taking that winter hair off, it's going to be replaced by something. They're doing it to control sweating and cooling and everything, but you can't just turn a horse out with a hunter clip when it's 10 degrees out. And we'll go on and talk about determining the body condition scores. And these are the places that you looked. I think Beth had mentioned these a little bit. But you can look along the neck, the crest of the neck will be nice and full. Right along the withers should have nice fat pad. You can see a crease down the loin and towards the tail. And looking at the ribs, a lot of times we look at the rib area to determine, help define the body condition scores. And we do have a, excuse me, we do have a fact sheet that you can get to help you assign a number. You can see down at the bottom, it says the UNEC, this horse is in a score of 1, a poor condition. You can see the backbones, there's real deep cavity there. Getting a little bit more condition, going up to a number 3, that horse is considered thin. Going up a little bit more condition, a 4 is still, it's moderately thin. All of these scores, the animals need to have their feed increased. Hay increased, and they probably need some grain, but you don't just feed them all at once. You've got to gradually increase their feed. And if you're just looking at the animal, you can see the picture of the animal in the upper right. You can see the ribs very easily. That horse is thin. And these are on the other end of the chart, the moderate horse. continue feeding the same way that you're feeding. They're in good condition. Flushing, and in a little bit, we've got a movie of course, that shows some fleshiness, I guess you could call it. And that crease, or there's a convex crease along the backbone. When the neck gets cresty or really fat covered, and that you have a deep gutter or a deep crease along the hips, then that's an extremely fat animal, and you can reduce the feed on these. And here's a little video that Beth took.
I can talk about that, Donna.
Okay.
This is one of my horses I visited a couple weeks ago when it gets running. So just by closing your eyes and running your hand over your horse, you can really get an idea of where he's fat and how much fat's there. So this little horse is in the prime of his health. It's funny because he's got dapples, and a dappled coat is quite the sign of a robust health. But the owner is showing how, well, it was showing how the fat was deposited behind the withers and over the ribs. And now I'm showing how the rump actually has the backbone is a depression. They call it a crease. So see those dapples? This horse is so healthy, but this horse is not really healthy because he's actually significantly overweight. There's way too much fat cover. And I would be worried about this horse actually getting laminitis at some point. He really ought to get less.
Well, let me see.
There he is.
Let me see if it will let us go on.
Oh no, you have to watch the horse jiggle for.
There we go. All right. So how much feed do I feed? In yellow, we've got there measuring the feed. A lot of times people will say, well, I just feed a flake of hay, a couple of flakes of hay, and a can of oats. But it's important at some point to understand how much weight that means. So the first time that you're deciding how much you're going to feed your animals, don't just use a coffee can, or if you use the coffee can, figure out how much that coffee can or that scoop holds, because different feeds have different densities, and different grains have different densities. And you can see here a bushel of oats. I know nobody feeds a bushel, but this is just to show you a bushel of oats weighs 32 pounds and a bushel of corn weighs 56 pounds. So the corn is significantly more dense than the oats. So if you were feeding a can of corn or a can of oats and you decided, well, I'm going to switch to corn, and you started feeding a can of corn, that's way too much for your horse. So it's very important to learn how much your different containers of grain hold. And also getting an idea of how much your hay is. You can weigh a bale of hay to try to get an idea of how much your hay bales are. And then if you're feeding a quarter or a half a bale, you can determine how much you're feeding. And Beth had put in this caution about beet pulp. Are you there?
Yes, I am. So I was just thinking of feeding problems that we have seen this winter, and lo and behold, there have been several cases of choke. Choke happens when horses bolt food, they don't chew properly, or when they just aren't have enough water in their systems, or the water in the feed that it can slide down the esophagus. Horses have a very dry esophagus compared to a cow. Things get stuck there, and beet pulp fed dry or mixed into food and no additional water can be very dangerous. The beet pulp tends to swell when it gets to the bottom of the esophagus, and then it can't get into the stomach. And we've seen an esophagus just packed right full of beet pulp, and it's a pretty difficult choke to relieve. I've seen this also with Fibermax pulling grain with trotter pellets. I don't know anyone who feeds this scoop, and the bucket is alfalfa pellets. And you have to be a little careful with alfalfa pellets. Some of them are compressed really tightly, and some are actually compressed under heat, so that part of the protein is denatured. So you want to get a good quality alfalfa pellet. And I love alfalfa pellets for geriatric horses or horses with poor teeth, because it's a great source of nutrition. It'll soak up a ton of water, and I feed it basically when the pellets have almost turned to meal. So it's an alfalfa wet meal by the time I feed it. And I have not had choke on that. And the geriatric horses, they go, well, all of the horses, they smell that alfalfa coming. I mean, they go bonkers. They really love it. Beet pulp has to be soaked longer than the alfalfa pellets. In fact, it's a really good idea. Best practices would be to fill a bucket double or twice as much water as beet pulp at least, and soak it overnight, so it is completely rehydrated, because beet pulp is dangerous. People tell me they feed it dry, and I just say, good luck to you. Hope they never do choke. So it's just a whole lot easier to prevent that. We've had ponies choke on hay stretcher pellets. I have an x-ray of a horse with a stretcher pellet right in its esophagus, and that was not able to be relieved. So choke can be very serious. Does everybody know the signs of choke? I'm sure you do. Hopefully you've never seen it, but horses, they become anxious. They do this arching of their neck and act like they're in pain. And then if the choke is there long enough, they produce quite a bit of saliva, which that doesn't get to pass into the stomach. So that the saliva starts coming back up the esophagus, and you'll get discharge from both nostrils, and it often has some feed in it. And the best thing to do for choke is take away all the feed and water for a while and see if they'll get rid of it on their own. You can offer perhaps sips of water later, but generally take away feed and water. Do not tie the horse's head up. We've had that happen one time. Horses can aspirate and get pneumonia following choke if they're not allowed to put their head on the floor and have the stuff drain out. And then you got to look and say what happened. Often it's a person who was who not the usual feed person, came by, forgot to soak the beet pulp, put it in the feed, and the horse got a feed that they won't.
So
Gradually over time, and make sure they're fed the same way every day. Okay.
Okay.
We've got a question about alfalfa pellets, and someone's using Stanley alfalfa pellets, and would your recommendation be to soak those before feeding every time?
It would, if the horse is used to them and you have had no problems, then obviously the horse can chew them. If I have a horse that has one tooth missing, so it's always the unopposed other tooth, the feed packs in, the horse doesn't like chewing anything solid. So with her, if you have a horse with dental issues or geriatric, I would say soaking it helps them eat it. So, but alfalfa, if you have a brand they consume and haven't choked, you can stick with it.
Okay, great. And just kind of jumping back quickly, and Brenda, feel free to unmute yourself if I am not quite catching your drift here, but this comment says that they have old horses that are skinny and not blanketed. All three will go into one stall for body heat. One horse is on Prasen. And
Sand, yeah, that's good things. Yep.
Okay, and has extremely long hair. And the Shetland also has long hair and is round like a butterball. And the other horse is skinny, but they prefer, even in cold weather, to be outside in shed row stalls.
Yeah, I'm totally in favor of horses living outside. Now, if they're skinny, however, and you are a little bit worried about the body condition, either you got to get them to eat more, or you should help them out with the environment and have some kind of blanket. I resist blanketing just because then you've got to deal with them every day. And my horses live out probably 20 hours a day. Do they at any time come in where they have their individual stalls to eat so that
They
aren't
always
competing?
eat inside by themselves.
Very good.
The Shetland pony never gets grain.
Well, the ponies don't need grain, really.
That's right. He gets an apple while they get their grain. That's his consolation prize.
The only thing I would say is make sure.
Hello?
Uh-oh.
More hay than they can eat. So I like ad lib hay. You cannot
do
feed
have
too much
that.
hay.
They
Okay.
all have unlimited hay.
Excellent.
But the skinny one was skinny going into winter, still is. I keep checking for shivering, especially. I locked him in.
I said the only way to get a skinny horse, the only way.
I think what she was gonna say is
As
the
well,
skinny
basically,
horse,
you're
you've
giving them
gotta
a
put-
mobile shelter and trying to reduce.
Say that again. What'd she say?
Beth, you cut out. Can you repeat? About the skinny horse?
Yeah.
They all have unlimited hay and the shed row is
Way to get a skinny
inside.
horse to gain weight in the winter. Yeah. So the question is about the shelter.
It's
I've
inside the
seen-
pasture, so they can go in whenever they want. And I lock the doors if it's super bad weather, like the blizzard, but they
Good.
don't like being inside.
So if they're if they're skinny enough that you're concerned, then you would add grains or concentrates to the skinny one's diet on top of all the hay they can eat. So the only way.
I think she was gonna talk about
Of calorie
adding,
loss through put blanketing, and I
So I should probably blanket the skinny one. She's at the point where she won't eat any more grain and she has all the hay she wants.
and you're feeding what type of grain?
The alfalfa pellets twice a day and senior blue seal feed twice a day for the two oldest one,
Mhm.
including the skinny one and the one that's on percent.
It'd be good to do fecal exams on them, check their teeth, and then actually calculate their intake, the pounds of each food that they're getting, and see if they can possibly eat more. Or so it'd be an individual thing to have a nutrition consult with your extension agent.
Well, I think we might need to move along here.
Yep.
'Cause,
Thank
we've
you.
we still have a lot. Thanks for your question. But we were talking about hay, and hay is the foundation of your horse's diet. You can start by calculating an average adult horse that has no other demands on its body will consume 2% of their body weight. If they're pregnant or if they're lactating, if they're working hard, that percent goes up. Environmental temperatures can affect the intake. We're going to be talking about increasing hay during cold weather. We're going to talk about your hay storage, how much to hay, and also where to find hay. But again, that 2% of the body weight, that's a mature horse, just doing maintenance, a horse that's already in good body condition and with no weather stress can be fed 2% of its body weight. That's all the feed. So that's hay and grain. Usually they don't need any grain, so 2% of their body weight. And how do you calculate that? A lot of people have the weight tapes that you can get. Sometimes you might not be able to get the weight tape. And so you can just use, a regular tape measure, or that sewers use a cloth tape measure, not a metal one. And you measure the heart girth and the body length of the horse. And there's the calculation that you can use to calculate the body weight. And Beth and her daughter had done some experiments where they actually weighed the horse, did the weight tape, and did the body calculation. And they came out surprisingly close. That's why they have those weight tapes. And this slide is just to remind us that when we say a horse, horses come in all shapes and sizes. Draft horses can weigh this. I've got 1,700. That's an average draft horse. They can get up over 2,000 pounds. An adult horse, we've got 1,000 pounds here, and they can be up to 1,200 pounds easily, or maybe just 800. A light horse, a young horse, maybe up to 750 pounds. A baby or a weanling, is weighing less. So they will eat, differing amounts of hay. And we wanted to give you a chance to think about and try to calculate out how much hay you need in your barn going into winter. It's a lot less expensive to buy your hay in the summertime and put it in your barn. Then you don't have to worry about it. You'll have plenty to go. This chart is just an estimate. This is the estimate actually that Beth uses, planning on one 35 to 40 pound bale per day per horse that covers their regular feed needs, any waste, because when you feed hay ad libitum, they're going to waste some. And also during cold weather, you're going to add more. So this is a rule of thumb that can help you make sure that you're going to have plenty of hay in the barn. So you just multiply. If you've got one horse, you need 30 bales of hay a month. If you've got 3, you need 90 bales. And you want to plan for at least 6 months that your horse isn't going to be able to get any forage on pasture. So that one horse, you're going to need 180 bales. If you have 4 horses, you're going to need 720 bales to cover your regular needs, the wastage, and increased feed during the cold weather. So how much forage do you have now? If you've got a barn full of hay, the easiest is to count the bales as they're going into the barn and weigh your average bale to see, are they 40 pounds? A lot of times they might be 30, 35. You might have some really dense hay bales that are 45 pounds. So how much do those your hay bales average? And then try to figure out how many bales in each section of your barn. This is an older type barn that has different bays. Then you can, once you figure out how many bales in each bay or section, then you can figure out how many sections you've got that are full, and then you can keep track of your bales during the winter. And we do have a fact sheet on do you have enough forage this year that you can use to help figure out how much you need and how much you have. And this is my attempt to show you how to calculate in that bay or section in your barn how many bales you might have. And so if this is an 8 foot tall by 8 foot wide by 8 foot deep section, you can calculate your cubic feet in the section. And if I've done this correctly, I've done this a couple of times and come up with different figures, so I'm not standing behind this completely. But that section that I've pointed out is 512 cubic feet. And hay weighs between 250 to 330 cubic feet per ton. I know we usually don't feed hay by weight, but we're going to get down to the bales. A cubic foot weighs about 7 pounds. And so that 512 cubic foot section has about 1 3/4 tons of hay. And if we calculate that back, that's equivalent to about 88 bales. So what? In the previous example, I'd said you need 112 bales per month. And actually, I used a different figure, I think. I'm trying to mess you up. And if you have 88 bales in each section, so you know, how many do you need, you know, in a month, or how many are you going to feed out in a month? That's 1 1/4 sections a month. But again, it's easier to figure out how much is in each section when you put it in, and keep that figure in mind as you're going through the winter to see how you're doing. Are you running short? Are you going to have to buy more so you can plan ahead? Don't wait until you're fed out your last flake of hay and say, oh, I guess I got to find a source. It's not that easy to come by. We've been mentioning that cold weather nutrition needs will increase. Animals have a thermal neutral zone, meaning that all things being calm and they're not losing any body heat to the ambient temperature, you know, they don't need extra feed. But with falling temperatures, or when there's a wind, or if their coat is wet, that means that they increase their need for more food per day increases. And this chart just gives you an idea of how much more a horse would need to consume. And when you're feeding hay, it's the microbes that can break down the hay, and they can give the horse extra heat. That last section, if you have a horse that's out and it's 32 degrees, and it's raining and there's a wind, they need 10 to 14 more megacals a day. And, you know, they're probably not going to be able to eat that. That's why we try to keep them dry and out of the wind. And how do you tell wind speed? This is just a chart. We can look at the smoke that's coming out of a chimney. You can look at how the leaves on the trees or the branches of the trees are moving to try to get an idea of the wind speed. When we start seeing evergreens in the winter swaying back and forth, we're getting up to 20 miles per hour wind. If the bigger branches are in motion, I think we all saw that this past weekend, up above 30 miles per hour wind. And I mentioned, this is an important concept. A lot of people think, well, it's really cold out, I'm going to give my horse more grain. If you want them to have more heat for their body, give them more hay, because that fiber is feeding the bacteria in their gut. And the bacteria, as they ferment, they're releasing heat. So they're giving up more heat, and they're helping to keep your horses warmer.
So Donna, can I add something on that?
Sure.
I think that concept of hay making body heat was not what the old timers used to think. We always used to talk about grain as corn as a heating food. Well, corn does have the most energy per unit, per pound, than of any of the grains. Corn's very good energy, but it really doesn't create body heat. And that's it's also another point with the hay is it's safer to increase the hay than it is to change the horse's grain level. So every change you make in concentrate feeding requires some time for the microbiome in the gut to adapt to it. And by constantly changing the ration, you're actually making the horse more susceptible to colic and to not doing well. So adding more hay is a very safe thing to do. Do that first.
Okay. And this time of year, we have people that are asking, so where can they find hay? They get caught, you know, maybe their regular distributor that they were planning to buy from is out, and they needed to find some more. These are just a few places that you might look. University of Maine Extension does maintain a hay directory. But this time of year, farmers that have listed stuff, they listed that last summer. So they may or may not have hay. The Department of Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry has a site called UMaine, and you can search for hay to find out farms in your area that might have hay. And if you're a Facebook person, there is a Facebook group, Hay for Sale, Maine Only. And that might be another source that you can access. And I'm wondering, how are folks doing? Are we doing okay? Do we need to take a break, or shall we go on?
We do have one question here about access to grass. Maybe that overlaps with the hay. Leslie heard that many horses shouldn't have as much access to grass. I'm looking at the conditioning chart, that many probably needs a diet.
That's exactly right. It's really tough with smaller ponies and minis who are different breeds, I understand, but they both eat way more than they need often. And it is difficult to get vitamin E into a horse that is overweight already. So it is, you can't put some horses, once they have had a bout of laminitis, you can't even let them breathe grass or they're going to try to founder again. So that is a problem. To get some good natural vitamin E tablets or
Right. Okay. Any other questions, Jason?
All I'm seeing for now.
Okay.
I like your comment, Jason, about Candlemas Day. This is perfect.
Okay, moving on. Storage of feeds. And we're looking at here mostly grains, but your hay needs to be weatherproof too. You don't want to leave the hay out in a stack in the field and then bring it in after it's weathered and gotten wet and everything. That's not good. So having a nice dry place. And I had dark here, and Beth goes, well, why is that dark? And I'm thinking of hay. If the hay has, you've got a window or something into your hay loft, it will bleach out the hay and lose some of the nutrients that way. For grains, certainly being rodent and pest proof, it's not just rodents. Bugs can get into your grain, and if you're storing a grain for a long period of time, you do have to watch out for both rodents and pests. And Beth had said she tries to go by, if you have grain that you're storing, try to have 3 barriers between the grain and the horse. So don't just put it in one of these metal buckets like I've got, and have that sitting in your aisleway. Have it in a tack room, have it secured. So what if the horse got into the tack room? Could they get into that barrel of grain? Just try to think about it, because that happens. And Beth can probably talk to us about how many times they've had to go out when a horse got in the grain bin.
And I've actually had my rather large fat Hanoverian gelding squeeze in the door of my grain room. I didn't even think he could fit in the grain room, but I arrived to find he had torn open several bags. And so even I only had one barrier at that point. We have now 2 locks on the door, and one is a horse-proof lock. He could open a regular latch.
Yeah. And for rodent control, having a metal grain container like you can use just a regular metal trash can. If you have a grain bin, make sure it's lined with metal or screening so that mice can't get into it, and make sure the lid is heavy enough that the mice or rats can't get into it. If you start having problems, and you've secured the grain and you don't have any spillage of grain, then you can start using traps. We don't really recommend putting poison out, because you've got your horses and they could get into it too, or you've got other mammals in the area that you don't want to get into that. There are a lot of different types of traps that are available. And if it becomes a big problem, look at where the rodents are getting in, how they're getting to the grain, and try to stop that. But it's, discovering that you've got a rodent problem in the middle of winter, it can be hard to get it under control. And that's why Beth was saying in the early fall, try to make sure you've got that situation in control before it gets out of hand. Okay, moving on to primary requirements for horse shelters. And we've got some like recommendations, and then we've got some state regulations that we'll talk about. Do you want to talk about this first, Beth?
Okay, sure. Any horse shelter should be a good, usable, horse-friendly protection from the extremes of weather, especially wind and wet. Absolute temperatures are not that big a deal when they're very cold, so long as the horse has wind and wet protection. So I'm just showing you this horse house because it's probably 30 years old. It was built very solidly and was doubled in size after probably 15 years. It has a metal roofing. It's lined with hemlock planks. So horses basically think wood is candy, especially if it's cedar or pine. And for anything to survive this long without just being chewed down to the ground is a testimonial to the fact that they don't like hemlock. And so the horses ought to have, I've seen people put up shelters and they say, well, there's shelter, they can all go in it if they want. But in truth, 2 horses get to go in and 1 horse doesn't, because there's so much competition between horses if in a lot of groups that there's always a horse that's on the bottom of the pile and a horse that's the boss. And if they can't all fit in, somebody's always getting driven out. That's all.
And other things to think about, consider your neighbors. You don't want to be offensive to neighbors. Believe it or not everybody loves horses and ponies and donkeys. This is if you're planning to build a new facility or new barn or new shed, have it convenient to a water supply. And we talked about water supply quite a bit. So if you're putting up a new shelter or something, plan on that water supply. Have adequate storage for not only your horses, but also storage for feed and bedding and equipment, if you have any equipment associated that you're going to be using with your animals. A lot of times people don't think about manure disposal, and whatever bedding you're using with your horses, it's going to be soiled at some point. It's going to become manure, and you've got to deal with it. And just piling it someplace, you want to have a plan on where you're going to put it, if you're going to compost it, and how you're going to spread it. You don't want to just have a 10-year pile of horse manure out there. That's not really the way to go. Have an area to work with your horse. This is again, a new type of construction. And whatever you're using, like Beth said, use durable materials, because you don't want to have to keep building your facility or your sheds again and again. And this is just a little line drawing of if you have a chance to place your horse facilities, and it's showing a gentle sloped area that goes down to a pond. And you'll notice that any of the areas that a horse could be in is kept back from that pond a little bit. You see the paddock is a little ways. You have a grass strip. And you can see the horse areas, the barns and everything are down plenty below the well that goes to the house and the residence. The manure storage is down again below the well. It's near the barn. So those are things to think about. When you're building a barn or a shed, make sure that the base of that where the horses are going to be is at least a foot above the surrounding terrain. You don't want to have a little river running through the barn. That's not going to be good for anybody. So make sure it sets up above the surrounding terrain and drains well.
Donna, I just wanted to add there that I had some neighbors who had trouble that their compost pile was too close to the property line and they had a little neighbor problem. So you want to be sure, I don't know what the regulations are beside your property lines. Make sure you're far enough away.
Well, some of them do vary by town, so checking with your town. And it's just, that's the case of making sure you're a good neighbor. Hopefully they moved it to keep on good terms with the neighbor. There are state of Maine horse welfare rules for shelters for horses. And horses are required to have a constructed shelter with a minimum of 3 sides and a waterproof roof that's provided at all times. And this is to protect them from the sun, the rain, the wind, and inclement weather. And further information, it has to be of sufficient height and size, so 8 foot tall generally, and 100 square feet per horse. But Beth talked about, just because you get the square footage for the horses, are they all going to go in at the same time? The floor should be dry and suitable for all the animals to lie down. And if you have horses that have a compromised health, then they should have improved housing by blankets or other methods. That's what our animal welfare rules talk about.
Donna, was I going to mention something about horses being able to lie down at this point?
You can.
Or
We
did
talk
I
about
mention it?
bedding. We talk about bedding in a little bit.
Okay,
but
we'll
you can
do. I'll
reinforce
talk
it.
about it by bedding then.
Okay. Ventilation. We talk about making sure that your animals have plenty of air, and if they're outside all the time and just have a lean-to, ventilation's great. If you have them inside a barn and you're relying on natural ventilation, you can see the upper schematic is showing how that works with wind and without wind. If you have a cold closed barn, you do have to rely on natural ventilation. You can also fortify that with forced ventilation. If you have a warm barn, you're gonna need to pump in air or have some type of fan system to make sure the air doesn't get stale inside the barn. It's very tempting if it's warm out or if it's cold out, you want to keep the horses nice and warm. Well, that's not, you've got to be careful of ventilation. And these are some signs that a barn is not ventilated well. If the temperature inside is more than 10 degrees higher than outside, it's not, if you can smell ammonia, if you walk in the barn and you're hit with the smell of ammonia and your eyes water, you've got to do something. The stalls need to be cleaned. If you see a lot of condensation on the inside of the windows and other surfaces, you've got to get some air in there, air movement, to get adequate ventilation. Otherwise, it can predispose your horses to respiratory problems, so you don't want that. Stall materials. The walls can be hardwood. Beth talked about hemlock. You can have wood with metal bars. We've all seen these types of stalls. The floors can be crushed stone or crushed rock covered with clay, sand. And then some people use asphalt or cement. Cement is not recommended unless you have rubber mats. If you go into old barns, a lot of them used wood. And the wood floors did have to be replaced occasionally.
Mhm.
And here's our bedding slide, Beth. You want to talk about that?
So in our area, we have certain sources of bedding that are readily available. And probably the number one is wood shavings or sawdust with all the lumber mills around we have. Although I got to admit, I buy shavings bags that come from Canada. You get a good, lots of wood there too. A more recent innovation in bedding stalls is to use actual wood pellets that are made to burn, and they make certain varieties as a bedding material. They're pretty good. I worry when they first get put in the stalls that the horses are going to think they're grain. So the pellets break down very quickly when they absorb some moisture from the air. I mix them sometimes with wood shavings to prolong the life and make them slightly more absorbent. Other bedding, peat moss, which is a big deal in Great Britain, and my pony clubbers all learn about peat moss, but I have never seen it. Shredded newspapers are a possibility. They're not real buoyant, but they will help absorb some wet. The big concern around here, we do occasionally find furniture makers that use black walnut, and so you do not want to use black walnut shavings as bedding, because just contact with the bedding with the black walnut is possible to cause laminitis. So you always say, well, everybody has a different level of bedding. Some people, some barns, they use the minimal, they just spread a little bit in. So it's a little bit to absorb the moisture from the manure piles. Some go overboard. There is one method of bedding, which I've adapted a little bit, was you think of in a stall, think of like a quarter of the stall being very deeply bedded, and it's called the horse's couch. So they get a couch part of their stall that they can go lie down in, that is truly a padded surface, so that when they go onto their knees to lie down and their hocks hit the ground, they don't feel the ground. And that's ideal. It gets disheartening to fill a whole stall with 6 inches of bedding and then have the horse just make a total mess. So try to keep all the bedding up against the walls so the horses don't roll and get cast. Gary Anderson, when I did a lot of work with dairy cows, we always used to talk about the knee test. So get on your knees in the stall, and if you can walk around on your knees and it doesn't hurt like mad, or they are dry and they don't get wet, then you've probably got a good place for the horse to lie down. I did want to mention that horses that aren't allowed a lot of space, that don't get turned out in a paddock where they feel safe. Some horses get so they don't dare lie down. They either don't have a companion that they trust to stand guard while they sleep, or they actually have difficulty getting up and down in a stall that might be a little small, or a stall that's not bedded enough. We've seen some horses, it's now been written about quite a few times, and we've seen several cases of horses that actually they'll stand in their stall and actually collapse because they're so tired and they don't dare lie down that they just eventually fall to the ground, but then they're alarmed and they struggle. Horses need to lie flat out on their sides and get good REM sleep for a certain amount of time every day. And I've heard estimates from an hour to longer to shorter, but they do need every day a period of REM sleep to actually be able to function. And if they don't get that opportunity, they almost turn what looks narcoleptic. So make sure your horses are lying down and happy, flat out, act like they're dead.
So some of you have talked about that some of your animals don't go into a shelter if you have them, even during cold weather. And Beth had some pictures of her horses that had the snow piling right up on them. When I had draft horses, I can remember going out and they had 3 inches of snow on their back. But let them decide. And that big barn there on the right, it's trying to show you that inside there are some animals that have gotten in there. Okay, and I did want to mention, talking about reducing fire hazards. We hear about this a lot with people that keep poultry. You'll hear about the whole poultry barn burning down, but you want to, for the horse keeper, think about these types of things. Don't allow smoking in the barn. Have a place that people can douse their cigarettes when they go into the barn. Have fire extinguishers by the exits, and they should be checked regularly, should be UL approved. Make sure your wiring and switches are encased in metal. And I know sometimes people think, well, they'll just do it themselves. It's better to have an electrician involved and have safe wiring in your barn. And be sure to include a 10-foot fire lane around buildings. And we hate to think about it, but should crap happen and we have a fire breakout, if you have at least a 10-foot section between buildings, you may be able to save some of the other buildings. Okay.
Add something in there.
Sure.
Just another thing to be aware of and cautious around is just the moisture level of your hay when you're baling that up, and being aware of who you're buying hay from and their practices. Growing up in the Holton area, we definitely had a barn go up from wet forage that was put in a barn and it igniting and causing a barn fire. So
yeah, and anytime you're putting hay in the barn, be careful of the equipment. We had a barn and a whole farmstead burned down because as they were putting the hay in, I think the exhaust of the whatever vehicle they were using caught the hay on fire, and they couldn't stop it. So certainly, during haying times, it's important to keep track of that. Are there any questions before we move on?
yeah, we had a question from David about recommendation for the direction of a 3-sided shelter, and I think Christy had some good response there that generally keep those openings facing to the south so that the sun can shine in there, with the walls on the north side to block that wind. And where I am in Bodenham, most of our storms are coming from the northwest, so you could change that, but somewhere between the northwest and the north is my understanding.
Right.
And then right. And Beth answered that too. Thanks.
Yeah, good. Okay, we're going to move on and talk about mud management, ice and snow management, and if we have chance, talk about fencing. We may or may not have chance with that. But some year-round challenges. How many people have paddocks that might look like this? A lot of mud. You get a lot of runoff that's not good. When we overgraze a paddock, you tend to have a lot of weeds come up. They might be poisonous plants. No grass, so your animals aren't going to get any nutrition out of that area. If they're out there all the time, they're going to compact the soils, and compacted soils, don't allow for the grass to grow. Keeping the fence in good repair. And when I had horses, we had trouble with moose going through. We had electric fence, and they'd go through during the winter, and they'd just take out 3 wires of electric fence and take it out into the hay field, and that was no fun. A lot of times we put too many horses in one section, or we have too few groups. Beth talked about having social groups of horses. Usually with other livestock, we don't concern ourselves with that as much. We look at the size, the ages, but we don't consider social groups. But with horses, we do. And why is mud such a problem? Well, it's unhealthy for the horse. There's a lot of bacteria and fungi out there. Beth mentioned scratches and rain scald and thrush, and you can get abscesses. It can be a breeding ground for all sorts of insects during the summertime. Of course, this time of year, we don't have to worry, but if you're feeding on the ground and there's, you're feeding directly on the soil, there's a chance that horses could pick up a lot of the soil or sand, and it can lead to sand colic, fills up their gut with sand. If horses or any animal is standing in mud, that's going to lower their body temperature, and they can get hypothermic. And it's Beth talked a lot about the unsafe footing being slick, and horses can get injured. Well, it's not just the horses that it can be a problem for. It's hard for humans. You can imagine trying to go out and then catch one of those horses in that mucky paddock. It can be kind of unpleasant. And during the summertime, the odors, and again, the neighbors aren't going to be happy with the odor and the flies. There are environmental issues. If that runoff starts running off your property and into streams, the sediment and nutrients, it's not good to have it get into the streams and lakes. It may contaminate some of the surface water, and it may get down in and contaminate groundwater. And why is that getting runoff and nutrients into surface water a problem? It can lead to fish kills and reduced aquatic life. So we're trying to consider the impact of water quality that the mud can cause. So we're trying to keep the mud under control. So how did it get so bad? There are a number of reasons. A lot of times it's too many animals. A lot of times there's too much surface water in that area. You might have really high organic soils or fine textured soils. Or just, if you've got too many animals, you can have a buildup of manure there. And so it's all that manure, all that organic matter stuff breaking down, the horses moving in it, stirring it up, making lots of mud. And generally it happens in high traffic areas, right along fence rows, tend to be an issue. And I mentioned compaction. When we're coming out of winter, during winter time is a time that our soils can rebuild themselves, because during freezing and thawing, that can alleviate some of the compaction in our soils. But if we have horses right out on the fields, right as the ice is leaving or the ground is thawing, it can squeeze that oxygen out of the soil, and it can become compacted again. So we're trying to reduce the compaction, but too much compaction leads to mud, and all of this stuff means grasses can't grow, vegetation can't grow. I mentioned soil texture, and this is our soil texture triangle that Jason and I use a lot with different client groups. We use it with gardeners and farmers. And the way you read this, a lot of times we talk about, well, loam is a good soil. And you can see the yellow part kind of in the center bottom, it says loam. And how you read that is the percentage of clay, silt, and sand. The percentage of clay is on the left side, it goes from 0 to 100%. So if you have soil that's 100% clay, it's up in this section of the triangle. Silt is the next texture, and it goes from 0 to 100% silt. And so if you have 100% silt soil, you're down in this area of the triangle. And sand is on the bottom. It goes from 0 to 100%. And you can see if you had 100% sand, you're over on this side of the soil texture triangle. And Jason and I can go on and on and on about the benefits of different types of soils and what we're looking for. But you've probably heard loam is good. You may have heard sandy loam is good. That drains a little bit better. Silty loam holds more nutrients. And if you want to find out, and the picture here on the right is a soils map. And the little numbers or the little letters are telling you what type of soil. All of our soils in Maine have a name. And our soil scientists have been all over the state and checked the soil textures. And you can go to either of these websites, the Web Soil Survey that NRCS put up, or the website from UC Davis, to find out your soil texture for your fields that you're using. And it will have a description of your textures, of your soil names. And if you need any help with that, Jason and I can help get you going on that. I mentioned having too many animals. You may have too much, or you need to understand the carrying capacity of your field or paddock that you're having the animals in. It depends again on that size of the animal. If you have 10 ponies, it's different than having 10 draft horses. 10 draft horses require quite a bit more pasture than the ponies would. And as Beth mentioned, a lot of times ponies don't need very much grass. The productivity of the pastures, a lot of times, the pastures aren't very productive because we've let animals out year round, and or they're covered with stones, or they have a lot of trees on them. So that productivity of the pasture changes the carrying capacity. And how often we put animals out there to graze. A lot of times, people have one field, they open the gate up, put the horses in it and leave them all summer and come back in the fall and pick them up. What happens is the horses will feed on a section of the pasture, and after a few days, those little plants will start sprouting new leaves, and the horses will come back and eat that instead, eat the first part of the pasture instead of eating more uniformly. So some people have gone to having a more rotational grazing scheme. But if we have time, we can get into that.
I just wanted to add, Donna, point out that there's a concept with horses pastures eventually turn into what they call lawns and roughs. And the inexperienced horse owner will say, look at all that grass out there that they won't touch. If they were hungry, they'd eat it. But what happens with the tall grass is often the places where the horses make manure piles. And as the grass gets older, it's lignified and it's actually inedible for the horses. They'd much rather eat the short, high protein grass. So basically, horses can be hungry in the face of what looks like a lot of grass in a field, but it's not edible for them.
Yeah. Can be up to their bellies, and people will say, well, they got plenty of stuff out there.
Yeah, but it's not.
So here are some remedies that we can think about to try to cut back on the mud. Certainly keeping animals off pastures when they're wet or when they're just coming out of the winter. And a lot of people say, well, that's not possible. They've got to get some exercise. Well, that's why you need to use sacrifice area. Just decide that there will be an area that you can stabilize so it can be considered a high use area that they can get out and get a little exercise without harming the bigger pasture. Having rain gutters on your building so you can divert water away from these high use areas is important also. And I mentioned having grass buffer strips. If you have a muddy spot, try to have a buffer strip before it gets into streams or ponds. We mentioned a little bit about grazing, dividing up your pasture so you don't have just one great big one, have a few smaller ones. If you have manure piles, keep them covered and try to manage the runoff from those manure piles so they're not getting into the pastures. composting the manure can help retain nutrients too. So mention a little bit about sacrifice areas. These are or exercise paddocks. You want them near the barn. You'll be using them all winter long. They should be some of your better drained soils, gravelly if you've got it. Should have a slight slope. You don't want to have it concave. You don't want to have a little pond in the middle of it. You want to have the water, if it gets wet, the water will run off. And again, have it surrounded by a grassy area, and try to stay away from streams, wetlands, and other bodies of water. So how you're managing that sacrifice area, should be picking up manure every few days when possible. This is to reduce your parasite load, and you're trying to pick up some of that organic matter that will turn into mud. I mentioned the buffer strips, a minimum of 25 foot wide, to try to filter any of the runoff from that sacrifice area. If you have a feed area where horses are going to be putting their head down there, you want to have it away, try to have it away from any muddy areas. You could feed on mats or belting, or have troughs, drilling holes for drainage, or have, if you have some sod, feed on the dry sod. Any other comments, Beth, before we move into stabilizing high use areas?
No, I'm looking forward in your time remaining. There's great slides on how to make a place that's mud free.
So you got a mucky place, and it's not going to change. You're going to have animals in there. So what can you do? And these slides, photos are from Greener Pastures. It's a bulletin that UVM put out many years ago, and it goes through the steps that you do to put in, a high use area. And at the bottom, what we're going to be talking about, you'll have the ground level. You'll have a layer of geotextile filter fabric. That's a woven type of fabric. You'll have a 4-inch layer of 1.5 to 1 3/4 inch crust stone, another layer of filter fabric. So notice this is 2 layers of filter fabric, and top it with 4 inches of pea stone. So just the first thing you got to do is you got to dig out some of that compacted soil. So go down 8 inches and 15 feet wide, because that's how wide the filter fabric is. It comes in rolls. And so 15 feet wide is, or a multiple of 15 feet is what you're looking for. So dig it out, dig it down 8 inches, and lay down that first layer of geotextile fabric. And then I mentioned covering it with 4 inches of crushed stone and smoothing that out. And actually, this is how they suggest doing driveways, and why the filter fabric is important. If you didn't put it down, all that crushed stone would mix with the soil underneath it. And a lot of people think, well, I'll just throw crushed stone out in the pasture and that'll be good. Well, it mixes with the mud and everything, and pretty soon you've got mud with little bits of stone in it. So it's important to have that separation layer to keep the crushed stone, have the air pockets in that crushed stone instead of having it filled up with soil. That's the whole key to this, and the key when you're putting in a driveway, or now when they put in new roads, this is what they use too. So you roll out the second layer of geotextile fabric, and then cover that with pea stone and level that off. Now, sometimes you may have a low spot that goes across a travel lane or something like that, and you'll have to put in a drain pipe at the lowest point to get the water out of that high use area. And this is just a 6-inch PVC pipe that they're using, that they use for these types of drains. And this is what it looks like. Nice and stabilized. During when you have rain or snow coming, The water will drain off it before it freezes, hopefully, so your horses can be kept safe, and the area isn't going to be a nuisance. You're not going to be losing a lot of soil to erosion. Now, all that looks expensive, and it can be. These are some numbers that came out of that bulletin, and it was a number of years ago. And this past year, prices have gone up quite a bit. But this is to give you a little bit of an idea of how much it might cost. And a few years ago, NRCS, that's Natural Resource Conservation Service, used to estimate that the rock gravel on geotextile cost about $10.50 a foot of your area. But that just gives you an idea. And this is something you have to do in the summer. You can't do it this time of year.
So
I mentioned-
Donna, we've got about a little less than 4 minutes left in the session. So
Yep.
keep
We got-
going, or
Yeah, I just got a couple more and we'll turn it over to questions. We mentioned about diverting rainwater with gutters, but you need to protect those gutters from horses. They can't be nearby. And we did want to talk about ice during turnout because we thought this was important. You can prevent it. I mentioned about having water drain off your sacrifice areas, the gutters, and don't plow the snow. If you're getting freezing rain on top of snow, that snow can provide some grip. If you have ice, you can remediate it by just keeping the horses in until it's safe, spreading used bedding or fresh bedding, spreading a layer of hay or straw. You can use salt-free sand, but don't use it where horses will be fed because, again, you have trouble with sand colic. And this is our last slide. The last slide will be for references, but we want to talk about downed horses on ice. Beth, do you want to take just a couple minutes?
Sure, I'll just say quickly that, as Donna said, improve the footing, spread sand. The technical large animal emergency rescue course taught us to actually spread rock salt even or sand around a down horse and make it an area that they can get traction, and they just might get themselves up. But if the horse has been down struggling, and rather than leave it there to freeze to the ice, if you can roll the horse onto a drag of any kind or get enough people, put them on tarp, try to get him into a barn where the footing is much better, or a bare driveway or someplace. A lot of times these down horses have struggled hard, they're out of energy and they're in pain. And so if you can give them Banamine, or sometimes we even give a little Torbugesic, they will then get their courage back and make an effort to get up again. So don't give up on them, just change their situation and relieve some pain and they'll do well.
And Beth had suggested you can call a vet first for advice, but when all else fails, you can call them for assistance.
Yeah.
And this is the last, we'll leave this reference up while people have questions. And we'll send you a link to these.
Yeah. Just want to thank you all for being present and coming on our webinar. I hope we helped you. If you have any questions, do put them in the chat or email us or ask right now.
Yeah, you can unmute.
Yeah. That 1 minute, Donna, pretty good.
1 minute.
Brenda Washburn, thank you for your input.
And Jason, maybe you could put a link to the demographic forum again, just so we can, Jason and I can say we did our job. We asked you, and again, it is optional on your part to complete it, and it is anonymous. It is a Google form, so we have no idea who it is. Any other questions? Well, we hope this has been helpful for you. And in a couple of weeks, February 15th in Lichtenwalner, we'll be doing a session on winter care of camelids. We had a question, people were wondering, Jason and his crew had set up a whole bunch of winter care of different livestock species. And we said, well, they didn't include horses and they didn't include camelids. So we thought we'd give it a try. So thank you all for attending.
Thank you. Okay.
There's one question about the soil texture, profile. So I just put a link to the web soil survey in the chat. It's a little bit of a complicated website the first couple of times you use it. So if that's something that you're interested in diving into to learn more about your pastures and your paddock area, definitely reach out to one of us or your local extension office, and we're all more than happy to walk you through that, or to just take your address and pull a report of what types of soils you're working with.
The UC Davis one is a little bit easier to use, but I like the NRCS one because they have more descriptions.
With that, I think we're over time, so thanks everyone for coming, and look forward to seeing you all soon.
Okay,
Thanks so much, Jason. All right.
bye.
Bye.